Welcome back to our series on the social consequences of engineering design and engineered products. In this session, we will look specifically at social issues associated with the supply chain, from the extraction of natural resources to the assembly of a finished product. At first glance, ABET, the organization that oversees accreditation and quality of the engineering programs in the United States, does not seem to address these social consequences. While social constraints are part of what engineering students do and learn as they advance through their programs, social consequences seem absent. Is this omission because these are issues for those in another field? Well, probably not. In fact, the social consequences of the many things, devices, appliances, and everything else that engineers design is buried in two places in Outcome C for engineering undergraduate students. Impacts on health and safety are definitely part of the social fabric influenced by what engineers do, as is sustainability. While the term sustainability is often associated exclusively with the environmental consequences of human action and choices, the term has been broadened by the Brundtland Commission and subsequent summits to consider social and economic consequences as well. For this series, we will differentiate constraints from consequences by considering whether the social impacts of products must be considered during design or should be considered. Those that must be considered are termed constraints and include customer perceptions, likes, and dislikes. Social constraints are covered in a previous session on social impacts of engineering design. Here we look at social consequences, which at some level are optional. As engineers, we may or may not attend to social consequences, although a variety of factors, including company reputation and ethical responsibility, may lead us to address them nevertheless. Social consequences or impacts are most often discussed in terms of human rights violations and other negative effects of outsourcing blue-collar jobs to developing countries around the world. However, engineered products can affect a full range of workers in a full range of countries, from blue-collar to white-collar. At a global level, that can be very complicated to address. Decisions as to where to extract, manufacture, and assemble products are historically based on economic considerations, especially cost. However, as the world economy becomes increasingly globalized, attention to how these outsourcing decisions influence people has become increasingly important. The pressure on companies to reduce the harm done to workers involved in their business practices, regardless of where they live or who they are, continues to mount. Alongside this increasing visibility to social consequence of globalized business practice comes a variety of metrics and measures that allow those involved in sourcing and outsourcing to more readily and more efficiently compare the potential harm that operating in certain countries can impart to the country's workers. Measures of social consequences come in two fundamental forms: holistic or big picture measures and more specific measures. One example of a useful holistic measure is the Social Progress Index, which gives a big picture assessment of how well countries are doing at serving their inhabitants. This measure of social responsibility at the country level considers three contributions to quality of life. The first emphasizes how well basic human needs are met for food, water, personal safety, and shelter. The second moves one step further by considering whether a country's inhabitants can not only meet their basic needs, but maintain good quality of life for well-being. And finally, the third measure looks at opportunities that a country provides for its people to advance and move upward both in society and in the world as a whole. At its core, the basic human needs component of the Social Progress Index measures how well a country can provide for food, water and sanitation, shelter, clothing, and personal safety of its people. Like measures of well-being and opportunity, the Social Progress Index evaluates basic human needs based on outcomes rather than inputs, so that they better represent what is really going on with everyday people. In theory, when basic human needs are not being met, outside investment can be invaluable to the common worker. However, the inability to meet basic human needs often goes hand in hand with political conflict and instability, which often makes it unwise for private industry to invest in meeting these needs through jobs and other economic resources. Here is what the basic human needs picture looks like in the world today. Failure to meet basic human needs is fairly common in many countries in Africa, where access to irrigation water and clean drinking water are a critical bottleneck in meeting basic needs. In addition, ongoing political instability and conflict that delays or impedes the ability to put infrastructure in place also creates a significant obstacle to meeting these needs over the long term. More specific information about the individual categories that make up basic human needs can be found by going to the Social Progress Imperative webpage. On this webpage is a map, an interactive map, that allows us to look at the entire Social Progress Index and how different countries rate relative to one another around the world. Or we can look at the three major categories used to predict the Social Progress Index: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, or opportunity. Beyond that, we can look at very specific measures that are involved in calculating each of these measures within the index. For example, we can look at deaths from infectious diseases around the world, or we can look at a more advanced measure used to predict opportunity, such as the freedom of movement in countries around the world. In combination with meeting basic needs, countries must also support foundations for well-being among their peoples. These foundations emphasize education in terms of providing uniform access to acquiring basic knowledge through enrollment in primary and secondary school. They also consider access to communication through such measures as mobile telephone subscriptions and internet use. And they also consider exposure to a healthy physical environment through reasonable air quality, wastewater treatment, and biodiversity. The fourth measure of health and wellness provides outcomes that represent a healthy environment and a solid education. Simply put, people who know how to take care of their bodies and have the resources to do so generally live longer and have less disease. The countries in the world that are unable to provide these foundations of well-being extend well beyond those in Africa into Asia and the Pacific Islands. Corporations and individuals within those corporations may choose to outsource manufacturing and other parts of their business to countries where the economic resources produce a return on investment in improving the quality of life and well-being of the workers in that country. Or they may choose to use their potential investment to negotiate greater investments in the well-being for their workers. While basic human needs allow people to survive and foundations of well-being allow people to be happy, opportunity allows individuals to grow, thrive, and ultimately to emerge from poverty. This is the last construct or measure in the Social Progress Index and represents where a country can go in the future. Economic investment in countries that provide opportunity is likely to provide greater social benefits to workers in these countries, as individuals are able to speak for their personal rights, exercise personal freedoms, pursue advanced education, and do so in a way that is non-discriminatory and includes both genders, male and female, as well as ethnic minorities. Unfortunately, countries that score highly in opportunity for their peoples are limited to Canada, Europe, Australia, and the United States for the most part. Many countries in South America also score reasonably well on the opportunity scale and may prove more attractive for socially responsible investment than other countries in the world. The Social Progress Index is not necessarily meant to be a detailed decision-making tool, but is rather a good way to begin to understand how countries across the globe compare in the social benefits and consequences that can result from responsible inclusion of those countries in corporate supply chains. Deciding where to purchase raw materials, manufacture and assemble products, and outsource other business practices involves complex decisions, even when considering only economics and profit. But metrics like the Social Progress Index can provide a wealth of information to add social responsibility to this decision-making process. Holistic measures provide a basic understanding and comparison among countries in terms of the likely social consequences or benefits of doing business in those countries. But sometimes it may be more important to consider more specific indicators. For example, more and more American companies and private enterprises are under pressure from customers and consumers to stay out of areas where human rights are regularly violated, with little hope for improvement over the long term. Human rights can be violated through poorly constructed factories and their potential for collapse, safety violations, sweatshop environments, or other poor working conditions that exploit and harm rather than support a worker's quality of life and opportunity to be upwardly mobile in society. Amnesty International is just one example of a non-government organization that provides deeper insight into the human rights violations that occur in countries across the world. As a nonprofit NGO, Amnesty International provides specific information regarding how and how many human rights are violated in countries around the world. Even in countries like Canada and the United States, which are generally considered more developed and advanced. Similar information regarding human rights can be found from for-profit consulting firms such as Maplecroft, which, unlike Amnesty International, provides quantitative information regarding human rights and calculates an index of how much risk some countries experience over other countries. The index varies from low risk to extreme risk and can provide clear-cut guidance to engineers, managers, professionals, and executives seeking to keep their business away from areas of the world where human rights are violated or in danger. In this session, we've looked at three potential sources of information that provide insight as to the social benefits and consequences of sourcing from or outsourcing to a variety of countries around the globe. The incentives for paying attention to social consequences along the supply chain can be many. Operating in countries that support and treat their inhabitants well most certainly can bolster a company's reputation and image. And it can also promote business stability by operating in politically and economically stable locations in the world. In the long term, knowing the social dimensions of the supply chain helps support economic growth by investing business and economic resources more wisely. Last but not least, doing business with countries that care and support their own people rather than exploit or oppress them is just a matter of sound professional ethics. This concludes our brief overview of the social consequences of doing business along the supply chain. Engineers and engineering managers are inevitably involved in the supply chain, from the initial design phase to the maintenance of product production over the long haul. As a result, engineers can and do have a voice in supporting greater social benefits of corporate practice and positive social consequences that can make a difference around the world. Thank you for joining us today. We certainly hope that this look into the world of social consequences has been valuable, and that you'll join us again as we look at social consequences beyond the supply chain as well as other real-world considerations in engineering design.